Hey guys, welcome back to Real Estate Informed, the channel that keeps you up to date on all things real estate. My name is Kevin, and today we're going to talk about the Federal Reserve and how I feel like the mass media is not covering this when it's very, very important. Okay, so the article that I want to talk about, I got it pulled up right here. I think it's by Ed Bailey, and the title is Federal Reserve Eliminates Reserve Requirements. This is big. I don't see any media outlet covering this. I don't understand why. There's one major thing that's going to affect this is housing, but I think that one thing that people just don't understand is what are reserve requirements. So let's get into that. Okay, so the article basically talks about how the Federal Reserve have limits on banks about reserve requirements. What are reserve requirements? So the first thing to understand is what are reserve requirements. Reserve requirements are basically that any bank, the physical money deposits that they have, they can lend on a certain percent of that, right? And so it used to be, 10%, a 10% of the physical deposits that people deposit into the bank has in physical cash. They can lend on a certain percentage higher than that. And, when times were tough, they would lower those, reserve requirements that the bank must have this much money in the bank in order to lend an X amount of dollars. Those are what reserve requirements are, because if a bank lends, say, $1 billion every single month, that doesn't mean that they have that doesn't mean that they have $1 billion in the bank. No. That means that they have a certain percentage of that $1 billion in the bank, and there's reserve requirements needed to lend on further, which is kind of crazy. You would think that the bank would need all that money to lend the money. That's not true. So there was reserve requirements. Now the Federal Reserve is saying, because of this pandemic and the situation that we're in, there are no more reserve requirements, which basically means that a bank can have $1 million in the bank and lend billions every month. There are zero reserve requirements. This is huge, and I'll tell you why. This is very big in the real estate market, because that makes banks able to lend infinitely. And when banks can lend infinitely, there's no reserve requirements of people depositing money, then there's no real shortage of money, in essence. If you think about it, usually a bank would have to grow, have to do advertisement, have people create accounts and put minimum deposits. That's the reason why banks have minimum deposits, that, hey, in your savings account, we'll charge you $50 a month or $12 or $13 a month for your account. But if you have a minimum deposit or minimum balance of $10,000, then we don't charge you anything. And so that's why these banks have these minimum requirements, is because the Federal Reserve requires them to have a minimum amount of money, physical money in the bank, so that they can lend an X amount. So now that there's no limit at all, so banks are going to take away from their marketing. They're not worried about bringing customers in and having a minimum balance. They're not worried about anything. Obviously, they're going to keep up on their fees, because banks love to charge you, so they're going to keep up on their fees. But there's no more Federal Reserve minimum requirement for the bank. So that means infinite lending. So what does that mean for the housing market? For the housing market, that means that there's infinite money. Banks on banks on banks are going to lend. Do you understand what I mean? And so when you do that, it's just propping up this housing bubble. And in my opinion, until November, the elections, and what might happen in the elections. But that was the same case with 2016. In November, everyone figured that in 2016, that after the election, whoever was president, whoever was, there would be some sort of market shift. And that just never happened. Real estate just continued to grow, never even looking back. Numbers don't even make sense anymore. And let me tell you something, that the Federal Reserve having no requirements for banks to have minimum balances is just another lever that the government is pulling to prop up this economy. Because without it, just think about it, without the government doing this, without the government having restrictions on certain loans, without lowering the interest rates over and over again, what would be our economy? You know what I mean? And so even through this pandemic, we've been solidified through this pandemic because of bailouts because of government assistance. But if that wasn't there, where would our economy be? And so without the government assistance, do we really have an economy? Just think about it, an economy or a housing bubble or a housing market that's propped up by government interference, is that really a housing economy? Does that really work? Does that really make sense? An economy should work on its own. So that's my video for today. That's just something to think about, that if the government's eliminating federal reserve requirements for banks, money's infinite. At this point, until the elections or whatnot, money's infinite. So if money's infinite, the housing bubble will continue to grow, period. There's no stopping it. So that's a scary thought. Maybe they're just doing this for the pandemic, and they might stop in 6 months, maybe when they have their next quarterly meeting. But for now, there's no requirement. So it's basically kind of going back to that whole, it's not fully going back to that in 2008, where there was lessened requirements for lending, but it's doing it in a different way. That's my video for today. If you guys liked it, please thumbs it up. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below, and I'll answer them on my next video. All right, thanks guys. Stay blessed.